custom notes in app state, and we're printing them in this UL in note list. So now, what do we need our form to actually do? Somehow the form needs to get what we type in here all the way up into the state of app component. The form doesn't need to know that eventually these things are going to get printed out in note list, right? That has nothing to do with Noteform's job. Noteform's job is just to get the data in the state somehow. And then note list will take care of the fact, or take care of getting whatever is in that state printed on the page. So what can we do here? Well, let's see if we can just get the form to do anything. Let's see if we can at least get it to console log something. I'm going to say for right now that I'm not going to do this when you submit. I'm going to do it whenever you type. If you saw in the final version, when you start typing in here, it actually just starts permanently saving it as soon as you start doing anything. So we'll do it that way. That seems fun. So in noteform.js, let's just deal with the title for right now. There's a change event that exists on the real DOM too. If we want something to happen when something changes, on change. And we could just put an arrow function in here. Changed. Remember, I took value equals empty string out. Watch my console as I start typing. Well, let's make the console a little bigger. That's a change. That's a change. That's a change, change. And every time our little function ran. Cool. It should probably do a little bit more than that, though. So this one is actually a class. So we'll give it another method called handle changes. What if it weren't? What if this were a stateless functional component and we wanted to add another function in there? This is just for illustration. We don't need to actually do this. Since this whole thing is a function, we don't even have a render method, right? This is just the return value of the entire function. Could I do something like this? You can make local variables inside functions, right? That's all I'm doing here. It's just that that variable happens to be a function. Now, if I wanted to call it, it wouldn't be this dot some other function, right? It's just a local variable. It's just some other function. Totally works. We could even use an old school function declaration too. You can create functions inside functions. They're just like local variables inside the function. But we do have a full-blown class in note form. So it's a method. So it is this dot handle changes, right? Handling those changes. So we could say on change equals this dot handle changes. Refresh. Start typing, handling those changes. So that works. So at this point, what is this inside handle changes? Well, what isn't it? Anything that we want it to be, right? Console.log this here. It's undefined. What about when we did the arrow function? What's it going to be inside the arrow function? It's note form. It's the object. Why? Because that's what arrow functions do. Arrow functions bind this to whatever this is at the time, right? That's one of the main differences between that and the function declaration. Arrow functions automatically bind this the way we are expecting them to in a context like this. Sometimes it's not what you want, but here it's exactly what we want. So we've looked at a couple of ways that we could get this to be the right thing inside here. One way would be add a constructor. And say this dot handle changes. You don't need to write this down because I'm not going to do it this way. Equals this dot handle changes dot bind this. And then anytime I use this dot handle changes inside here, it's going to be bound to this, to the right this, to note form. Or rather to the instance of note form. So that way I wouldn't, because the other way, the first way we learned was to say this dot handle changes bind this. But then if we have on change equals this dot handle changes, we'd have to do bind this again, right? Because we only bound it up here. So we'd have to do it again. But if we do this, then it's going to already be bound to the right thing both times, right? So it saves us the repetition. Now, if you know you're going to need it to be unbound another time, you may not want to do that. You can unbind it, but it'd be nicer not to have to. Did you have a question still?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Setting this dot handle changes equals that bind return.
It returns a function. So bind returns a function, which is why we're able to pass it into add event listener and stuff like that.
Why are you setting this dot handle changes equal to the result of that?
So what the right side of the equal sign here, the right side of the assignment is doing, is returning a version of the exact same function, but with that binding in place. By sending it back to the same property of the object, now this contains a reference not to what we originally set it to, but to the bound version of that. So we can call that function normally, but we're not calling the original version of the function anymore. We're calling the bound version of the function. Right, you don't have to manually bind it then in the future. Yep. So that's the other way, and we learned that yesterday, right? But as discussed, an arrow function binds it the way we want, right? So what if we put an arrow function in here, and then all that arrow function does is call this dot handle changes. So I'm no longer binding it up here. The word bind appears nowhere now. So we established that inside this arrow function, this is going to be bound correctly because that's how arrow functions work. So now this dot handle changes isn't actually an event handler anymore, is it? It's just a method we're calling with the dot syntax. And what do we know about calling methods? with the dot syntax or the square bracket syntax, this gets bound to the object that you called it on. So now inside handle changes, since handle changes isn't handling the event directly, we get the right thing. Suppose we really, really needed that event object inside there. Well, the arrow function will receive it, right? So we can just pass it on. And then we can still do things like prevent default or whatever. Though we'd probably want to do it inside the arrow function. So that is yet another way of doing it. And nothing to do with React. That's just JavaScript. So for all of our event handlers that we did in Jeffervescence, instead of calling bind this on everything, we could have made the event handlers arrow functions and just called the function that we really wanted to call from inside there. And it's not an uncommon pattern. How do we want to do it? Do we want to do it this way? Do we want to learn the easiest way? So there's an easier way. It just has caveats. But the caveats are kind of okay in this context. And so here's what's up. There's a new feature. It's really a feature at this point of Babel. Babel, remember, is pre-processing all of our JavaScript because we're not writing pure JavaScript here. We're including JSX, which isn't really JavaScript. But by running it through Babel before we ever send it to a browser, we're able to use some stuff that isn't actually built into the standard. So there's another thing. Classes, property initializers. So property initializers are actually a proposed standard, and they are going to be in ECMAScript in the future as part of a proposal called class fields, which has now been merged in with this other thing. And what they'll say is, inside a class, let's find an actual class, like note form. Again, not React specific, it's just a JavaScript thing. Inside a class, we know we can declare methods like this, but it'd be cool if we could just set properties directly like this. Now, right now, what we would have to do is put that in the constructor, right? If we wanted to do something like that, put in the constructor this.food.banana equals banana. But this proposal is saying, hey, what if we could just do that? What if we could just set our properties that way by just saying like this food, banana, right like that. So that proposal has reached the stage where it will be in a future of ECMAScript, a future version. It will become a standard. It has gotten that far. It is at the stage where it could potentially change a little, so it is still, subject to change. It's probably not going to change a lot, though. And it is supported in Babel, and all our stuff's going through Babel anyway, so we can use it. So one nice effect of this is that we can set state that way. We don't actually have to use the constructor. We're not going to do that right this second. But here's another thing we can do. Instead of just making handle changes a method like this, the old way, what if we make handle changes a property that happens to equal an arrow function? We still have this.handle changes, but now it's bound to the right thing right off the bat. So if, when you declare the method, you use this property initializer syntax, where you're just setting the property equal to something, and that something happens to be an arrow function, then this is bound correctly right from the get-go, no matter how you call it. Whether you call it manually with this dot, or whether you use it as an event handler. So that's the way I'm going to do it right this second. There will be notes about this and lots of examples in the notes on the webpage. So now I could say this dot handle changes. And this dot handle changes is a property that happens to be equal to an arrow function. And now, start typing. This is back to being the instance of note form. It's what we wanted it to be. So if you just get in the habit of writing your methods this way, you won't ever have to worry about it. But not supported directly in the browser yet. But in React, we don't care. We're not sending this stuff directly to the browser anyway. All right, so what should this actually do? Handle the changes, right? Yeah. Handle changes, pretty please. Done. So where does the note data actually live? In app, right? On the state of app. Sure, we could pass it all the way down to this component and make changes to it. That's not going to do anything. You can't change your props like that. You can access them that way. We could totally read them that way. So if we wanted to like pre-fill the form with data, we could do it like that. But if we want to change the state of app, there's only one component that can do it. And that's app, right? App is going to have to call set state itself. So, Okay, I think I see where you're going with this. Let's go ahead and write the method on app that's going to set state for us. Then we'll worry about how we can actually call that from somewhere else. Oops. So in app, here's our constructor. Here's render. Render is going to remain the last one. Let's make a new method called saveNote. And instead of doing this, I'm going to use our new trick and set it to an arrow function. And what I'd really like is for it to receive a note as an argument, and then it's going to add that note to state. So when we modify state, we generally make a copy of the thing that's in state that we want to add to, right? So I'm going to make a local variable called notes to hold the list of notes. And it's not an array this time, it's an object. This.state.notes. We know that that's not going to save our local variable notes to a copy of this.state.notes. It's going to be a reference to it, right? So we need a copy of it. And we learned the other day about the spread syntax and how we could get things out of an array that way. You can do it with objects. Surprisingly, unlike the array spread, it's not actually part of ECMAScript, but it is supported by Babel. And you see it used all the dang time in React. So we can do basically the same thing. Curly braces, spread, that notes, and it's going to get all, the spread is going to get all the properties out of that object. And if we wrap it in an empty object, well, that object's going to have all the same properties. But this time I'm working with a copy instead of the original. So it's just worth knowing, unlike the array spread, this isn't actually an ECMAScript standard and is not supported directly by the browsers. But you can safely use it in React because it is supported by Babel. And it is in pretty widespread use. So now we've got a copy of notes. So we can't just push, right? This is an object. So how do we add this note to this notes variable, notes object? oh, nodes dot I don't know, some property probably equals note. Now it's in there, right? What were we using as the keys? Note dash something, right? But we've got the note passed in. Yeah, what about like notes square bracket note.id? Seem legit? Then we can call this dot set state notes, like that. Right, same thing as saying notes inside this object literal. If the value is in a variable with the same name as the key, you can just shorten it to this. Seems far-fetched. Maybe we can experiment with this. You all installed the React Dev Tools, right? As part of the setup process a couple weeks ago? Now, it may be way down in your tab list in your developer tools. If it is, I suggest finding it and dragging it to right after console because we're going to be using it a lot. This is your new best friend. It should be in your developer tools. It should be another tab called React. Now, it may be off the screen. You may have to use this little arrow here to find it. Yeah. So switch to it and then drag it earlier because we're going to use it a lot. And this gives us a lot of super handy things. You see app will be highlighted here. And over here on the right, we see its props and we see its state. We can just inspect it like that. And you can go through the tree and find all of them. Or look, there's a little search box here. So if you don't want to have to dig through that tree, if I just search for form, there we go, note form. I can see its props and its state. Also, I have this selected here. If I switch over to the regular inspect under elements, and I had an actual DOM node selected, like drill into here, select this div, switch over to elements. It didn't do it. Why didn't it do it? Oh, because it's a jerk. Maybe if I refresh the page, it would. The hot reloading thing is a little strange sometimes. But do notice this. I'll click on the app component. And remember how when we used the element panel and we clicked on one of these things and it said $0 here, we could get to that from the console? In the React DevTools, I click on a component and it shows me $R. Flip over to the console, $R is now app component. So if I want to test this method in isolation without calling it from inside my code, I can say $R dot, what did I call it, save note, and call it right from here. Therefore, I could do something like this. Let note, or let my note equal ID 67, title, whatever. Called $R dot save note, pass in my note, see if it works. There it is. So if I have a note with an ID, it seems to work. I'll say let my other note equal, and before we do that, flip back to the React DevTools, look at app, look at state, and we see it's there, and we see it's indexed by that ID, right? So it really did update state, which redrew the page. Let my other note equal something without an ID. Save that, my other note. There it is. So it's saved at the key undefined. Cool. It still saved it, but the key is the string undefined, which isn't terribly useful, and if I saved another one, it would save it over the same key. Point being, we probably need to handle the case where the note doesn't already have an ID. So we could say, if not note ID, do something. Then we can say note.id equals, and we'll follow this pattern kind of. I don't really want to keep track of a max thing again like we did last time. That was error prone. I'm going to set it to a template string here. Note dash. How about date.now? Seth showed you new date. Date.now does the same thing. It's a newer syntax. So now by the time we get down here, the note's definitely going to have some ID. And see how that works. So I've still got the app component selected, so I can still get to it with $R. My console, I'm again going to set my other note to something without without an ID. Food, said the fat guy. That's me. $R save note, pass in my other note, which does not have an ID. There it is. Look at our state. There it is. I like it. I like it. Yeah, down to the millisecond? Since January 1st, 1970. Yeah. Or maybe it's, yeah. It is seconds, yeah. Yeah. Unix epochs are seconds, yeah. Not milliseconds. The original one, yeah. So, okay, cool. I like it. So now I've got unique IDs. So now we know that save note. The question is, how the heck do we call it from way down there? Some of you made this work. Who made it work? All right. She already told me how she did it. Class didn't hear it, but we'll give Dom a chance right now. What'd you do, Dom? Okay. So if we have data in one component that we want to send to another component, use props to do that, right? We've used that to send some regular old data. Why can't we just send a method that way? Why can't we send a function as a prop? We can. We can send functions as arguments to other functions, right? We do that all the time. We can totally send functions as props. So down here, main receives notes. Why doesn't it also just receive a prop called save note? And that's just going to be this.save note. Not the return value of save note, right? The actual method, save note. And because of the way that we declared this as an arrow function, we know the binding is going to be correct too. So that's going to main. In main, we have our list of props here. Note list needed the notes out of there. Note form needs save note out of there, right? That's the component that really cares about this. So we could say save note equals what? Props dot save note. Not the return value, the actual function. So down in note form. Now this is not a stateless functional component. This is a real component. So how do we get to that from here? We could do something with a constructor. We don't have to just yet. What if inside here I want to get to that? How do you get to your props inside a real component, a class-based component? It's automatically going to assign them to this dot props. So real components that extend React component always put their props on this dot props as an actual property of the component itself. No matter what? No, it'll be the instance of noteform dot props. So this does have to be bound correctly for this to work. Yep. Yep. Okay, so handle changes could call this dot props dot save note. I'm sorry, Gabby, what? Yep, save note. So it's passed into note form as a property, right? We get to our property with this dot props because it's an actual class that extends component. So yeah, this dot props dot save note. So what are we going to pass in here? A note that's made out of whatever's in input and text area. So we have to do that thing. We could put refs on both of these and just build the note here inside this method. That's not probably the best way to do it. We want to keep it a controlled component. So it looks to me like we're actually going to need note form to have its own state. And all it'll track is the current note that's in the form. Might be able to do it another way. We could, for example, inside render, create a new object called, const note with a blank ID and a blank body or something. And then bind it that way. Value equals note dot title. And then on change that thing and then pass it up. We could totally do that. Later on, we're going to need it to be in state, but it wouldn't actually have to be in state right now. Do you see why that would work? Inside render, we have this node object that we create. We bind the value to that on change. Then we could just make sure that we pass that in. I'm going to go ahead and use state. It's nice to have state on as few components as possible. I know for a fact that later on in this project, we're going to need it to be in state in order to get the full-blown WYSIWYG editor with the bold and all that stuff. So we may as well do it now because it's a fine way to do it. So we do need a constructor now. We need a note there. Never mind what exactly I'm putting in state right now. What else do I definitely need to do to this constructor? I already called super. Yeah. Since this component has props, remember, props is really just an argument being sent to this thing. Since it's a class, it's being sent to the constructor. And when we don't define our own constructor and it's just calling the constructor from component, it handles that. If we're writing our own, we have to make sure we get the props and we pass it along to React component. Because that's how this dot props gets set. Otherwise, we wouldn't have access to them. So we're going to set note to a blank note, basically. I'm going to make a separate function that returns a blank note. because I think it'll be a little easier to keep track of later. So I'm going to just make another method here called blank note. I'm not going to use this inside there, but I'll just use a property initializer anyway. And all this is going to do is return my blank note. So an ID of null, title, empty string, body, empty string. Gives me a convenient place to return to if I ever want to add any more properties. And so then the initial value of this.state.note will be the return value of blank note. So now we have this.state.note. It's a blank note. So down in our form, we could say this.state.note.title is the value of the text input. And on the text area, we could also say value equals this.state.note.body. Controlled components. And on change, it's just going to call this.handle changes. Now, I don't need a ref here. Here's what I'm going to do. Up in handle changes, I'm gonna need a note object for the one that I'm modifying, and it should probably start as a copy of whatever is in state, right? So I'm gonna use the spread syntax and make my local variable note a copy of this.state.note, which right now is blank, but it may not be forever. Then what I want to do is change the value inside note that changed on the form. So handle changes is going to run if this input changes or if this changes. So how do I tell which one it was? What event is that change firing on? It's not the form, right? Like it would be on onSubmit. Since onChange is right here on the input, the target of the event is going to be either this input or this text area. Does that make sense? It's going to be the thing that changed. So event.target.value ought to get what's typed in there. So to change that on the note, notice I gave the input a name of title, and I gave the text area a name of body. These two things aren't doing anything. So I could say note square bracket event.target.name. That's going to be either title or body, depending on which one I was actually typing in at the time. So this ought to update my local variable note to be whatever I typed in there. So then I need to make sure I update the state on note form itself, because that's what's actually bound to the value of the inputs. So I'm going to have to do that before I worry about save note. So this dot set state note. Right at the note key, I want the value of this note object right here. And then I could do this, and it would probably work. What if I did this.state.note here? Would it be the changed version or not? If not necessarily, why not? Set state is asynchronous. So you call set state And it says, okay, I'll get to work on that, but you go ahead and do your thing, man. I'll just be over here setting state. So it'll run this next line of code potentially before that has finished. It's just the way set state works. It happens in the background. So if you want to be sure that the next thing happens after this finishes, you can pass in a function as the second argument to set state and make it do what you want. So inside there, we could call this.props.saveNote. Make sense? I'll just... Not if you want to be sure that state has already updated. So if we just called save note and passed in this node object, we know it's got the updated value. But if we wanted to actually use this.state.node in here, we would have to do it this way. I'm going to do it this way to illustrate that point. Because state will not have necessarily been updated unless we do it this way. Why couldn't I just pass this in instead of this arrow function? Because the second argument has to be a function, and this isn't a function. This is the return value of a function, right? This expression here is actually calling save note. So if I pass this in as the second argument, I would be passing in the return value, which isn't a function, and I would get that error that it's not a function. Does it work? I don't know, man. Seems pretty complicated. EV is not defined on line 24 of note form. It's being passed in whether we name it something or not, but we need to name it something if we're going to use it. Notice what I did not do. Oh, read error message. Let's go back to my code before I even read it and start trying to troubleshoot. I'm not going to know where to start with my troubleshooting, right? Unless I actually slow down, read the darn error message, and get a clue of what's wrong. Read your error messages. It'll help you. Forgive me if this seems obvious. It's a habit you have to develop, and it takes time to develop habits. Okay, no more errors. Does it do a thing? Title my note. My brain. Ooh, there it is. My brain. The pain. There it is. Let's look at app in our React DevTools. Look at its state. Yeah. There it is. The pain. My brain. With its own ID. Now, right now, I have no way to get another blank note, do I? If I keep typing in here, it's just going to keep adding to that one. But by golly, we can persist what we wrote in the form. Save a note from the form. Life is good.